Be a man who can face breakup, lose a job, deal with debt and still say I'll figure it out. Be a man who watches his world collapse, feels the pain, bleeds in silence, and still sharpens his sword. Be a man who doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't cry for attention. He builds himself in the dark. Be a man who turns rejection into fuel, betrayal into discipline, and loneliness into a fortress. Be a man who doesn't fold under pressure, who looks failure in the eye and grins back. Be a man who leads, who protects, who walks alone if he must, because weakness is contagious and strength is a choice. Be a man who earns respect without asking, who doesn't need validation, who becomes the storm. Be a man who doesn't escape reality, but dominates it. Be a man who turns pain into power, heartbreak into hunger, and setbacks into strategy. Be a man who walks through hell, lights a cigar, and keeps walking. Be a man who doesn't flinch when life throws knives. He catches them and learns how to aim. Be a man who gets stabbed in the back and forges armor from the betrayal. Be a man who hears you're not good enough and makes it his war cry. Be a man who doesn't seek comfort, he seeks conquest. Be a man who knows love is a gift, but never a leash. Be a man who commands silence louder than noise. Be a man whose scars tell stories, and whose silence makes cowards nervous. Be a man who doesn't fear being alone. He fears becoming average. Be a man who sees through manipulation, breaks free from emotional slavery, and refuses to be tamed. Be a man who is calm in chaos, brutal in battle, and loyal only to truth. Be a man who doesn't react, he calculates. Be a man who doesn't follow trends, he builds empires. Be a man who makes peace with his demons and uses them as generals. Be a man who takes losses like lessons, not excuses. Be a man who keeps his circle tight, his focus tighter, and his mission untouchable. Be a man who never begs for a seat at the table. He builds his own and sits like a king. Be a man who is too focused to be distracted, too wise to be deceived, and too dangerous to be controlled. Be a man who knows that peace is earned through war, and softness is a luxury built on strength. Be a man who doesn't chase butterflies. He builds a kingdom so lush, they come to him. Be a man who doesn't fear heartbreak. He fears mediocrity. Be a man who turns silence into strategy and pressure into diamonds. Be a man who doesn't ask for mercy. He becomes the consequence. Be a man whose presence changes the room, whose eyes hold storms, and whose words weigh like bullets. Be a man who's feared by weakness, respected by kings, and loved only by the real. Be a man who never submits to a broken system, who walks through illusions and sees reality for what it is. Be a man who bends fate with discipline and carves legacy with pain. Be a man who is hunted by his past, haunted by his vision, and still walks forward without flinching. Be a man who never loses himself to love, to lust, or to lies. Be a man who knows his worth is not defined by a woman, a paycheck, or applause. Be a man who dies on his feet rather than lives on his knees. Be a man who walks like time owes him nothing and still gives the world everything. Be a man who can smile at chaos, laugh in war, and love without chains. Be a man forged in fire, fueled by failure, and crowned by solitude. Be a man who no longer needs to prove himself, because he already became everything they said he couldn't be.